Hi, this is Evelyn Bowden. Thank you for joining me. With so much in the media recently about public schools, I thought it fitting to begin Let's Talk with Evelyn Bowden with a rebroadcast of portions of the interview with Dr. Pedro Noguera, an expert on race and education. The interview originally aired January 8th, 2011. However, the insight into the educational environment in public schools here in the United States of America is so relevant today. The interview is approximately 24 minutes long. I would advise listening with pen and paper in hand. Here now is the interview with Dr. Pedro Noguera in progress.
Your bio said that you were a professor of teaching and learning, and I'd never seen that put together like that. So explain to us about teaching and learning and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, teaching and learning, I would say that if there's no evidence of learning, then you're not teaching, you're just talking. And so the department I'm in at NYU looks at that relationship between teaching and learning and how to make sure that students are receiving the best quality of education possible. It's an interdisciplinary department that includes people in the sciences, but also in the humanities and psychologists. So it's all focused on how to bring about improvement in our schools and prepare.
You know, somewhere in some of your writings I read where you said that if schools do what they've always done, they will fail. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the thing is that schools have to constantly change because we live in a constantly changing society. The children of today are not the same as children 10 years or 20 years ago. As a result of all the changes that are occurring, technology, families are changing, demographics in our society are changing. And so you have to constantly, as an institution, our schools have to change. We have to change what we teach with respect to the curriculum, but also how we teach it, so that we're ensuring that we're meeting the learning needs of students. And that's a challenge, I think, for many educators, because in many cases the kids are ahead of the educators. I often point out that the average student, middle school student, is more comfortable with technology and more adept with it than the average teacher. And that, I think, speaks to a big problem we have in our schools.
How did you come to love education? And I say love because I can feel it in just looking at your work and listening to you as you address groups. And so how did you come to that love?
Well, I think it starts with the fact that education has had such an important impact on my life. I come from a poor family. I grew up in New York City. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. But my parents managed to send all 6 of their kids to college, some of the best colleges in the country. And so I've personally experienced the benefits of education, and I know that education is the best pathway, best tool we have available for expanding opportunity in this country. You look at almost every major social problem we have in this country, whether it be unemployment or the high incarceration rates or teen pregnancy, whatever it is, education is almost always at both part of the problem and potentially part of the solution. And so I view my work in education as really a way to try to create a more equitable and just society. And I think for African Americans especially, it's always been key to our liberation.
Along those lines, in fact, as a lead into that, will you tell us what happened? And this is something that I heard say in one of your speeches when you were talking about your family moving to Bayshore, and something happened with your 9-year-old brother in the education system.
Yeah, and this is, I think, unfortunately, a very common experience because my family, we have a Spanish surname, and because of that name, the school district assumed that my brother could not speak English, although he spoke English fluently. And because they didn't have any classes for children who didn't speak English, they put him in a special ed class. And this was a class of students who had learning disabilities and in some cases were mentally retarded. So my brother comes home and he tells my father, "Daddy, I think I'm in the wrong class." And my father, because he trusts the schools, tells him, "No, you go ahead and do your work. Just listen to your teachers and get your job done." And my brother comes home again the next day and says, look, I'm sure I'm in the wrong class. There's no work going on, and kids are throwing airplanes. But again, my father wants to trust the schools because the way he's been raised is that you trust the educators. You don't question their decision-making. But finally, my brother comes back again and says, look, I'm not learning anything. There's nothing going on here. And my father decides to show up at the school and see for himself. And my father was a police officer in New York City, so he decided to show up in uniform because he assumed that he'll be treated with a little bit more respect if he does. And lo and behold, he finds that my brother is placed in the wrong class and insists that he gets changed. He then gets a test, and the school decides, in fact, that he's a gifted student. Well, that same brother ends up years later going to Harvard University. Now, the thing is this, that if my father had not intervened and not insisted, and if my brother had not persisted in raising questions, things could have turned out very differently for him. And I point out as a reminder, because we have many kids out there who don't have parents who are watching what's going on, who don't know how to be effective advocates for their children. And it should, I think, disturb all of us that too often kids who don't have that kind of support end up slipping through the cracks.
Yeah, somewhere you said that, those parents who can afford to move their children to perhaps private schools or better systems in the public school system, that if all of them leave the failing school, that leaves them at a disadvantage, talking about the system, and those parents that are left. What would you say to in those situations where we have schools that need some work and need assistance rather than vacate those schools?
Well, the thing is that we have to really, our public schools are so vital, especially to the people who have the least, the least resources. Middle class people can often opt out, get their kids to private schools, or they can get into a district that has better schools. But if the middle class leaves, and we leave the schools just to the parents who don't have the time or the resources or the know-how to fight for quality education, what we see is schools end up going downhill, and they don't meet the needs of the children the way they should. And so it's very important that communities stay involved with schools so they can hold them accountable and ensure that a quality education is available to all children, regardless of their background. It's very important that happen because when that doesn't happen, we see schools deteriorate and they become places where only those who have no option send their children.
Yes, and that is a tragic sight, and it's especially tragic for a large number of the children that remain. I'm going to pretty much, as far as the trouble with black boys, let you tell us, what is the trouble with black boys?
Well, the trouble with black boys is, I use that term because so many black boys are in trouble, and they are overrepresented among the children who are placed into special ed classrooms, among the children who are disciplined and suspended and expelled from school, among the children who are dropping out and not performing academically. And what's important about that is that the patterns we see in our schools influence the pattern we see among adult males. And so black boys who are not successful in school are going to be more likely to be unemployed, more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to be, in some cases, killed at an early age. And so we have to try to find ways to intervene early with our black boys in schools. And I wrote the book both to call attention to the problem, but also to call attention to the solutions, because the fact is that there are schools that are doing a much better job with black boys and in providing the kind of academic and social support that they need to be successful. And what frustrates me is that we don't spend more time learning from these schools, because these schools are showing us that with the right support, young black men can be successful and contribute not only to themselves but to their families and their communities. And we need to make that kind of investment on a much broader scale than we do right now.
One thing that I was looking at the introduction to the book, and you said that even as babies, black males have the highest probability of dying in the first year of life. And as a mother, that slaps me, right in the face, to think, that, even it just coming into this world, the black male is already in trouble.
Yeah. No, this is the thing that makes you wonder what's really going on here, because the challenges, the problems facing black males in particular, they show up in health, they show up in employment, they show up in education, they show up in the criminal justice system. That is, you can't just say it's just one thing. It's not just one thing. And because it's a multifaceted problem, you need a multifaceted response. We need mentors in schools. We need social workers who can we have too many young boys being raised by single parents, being raised by teen parents who really are not ready to raise a child. And this creates a dynamic where these children come into school, they're really not prepared, and they're not receiving the proper support at home. So we have to respond in a more comprehensive way than we do right now. We need to get churches much more involved, but we also need to get organizations like the Boys and Girls Club and civic organizations, the fraternities, sororities, doing more to provide support, particularly to those boys who don't have fathers in their lives.
Looking back, I had one son that came through the school. There were situations where, because he didn't fit the box, he didn't fit in the perceived notion of what a black male should be, he was often faced with a situation where teachers tried to force him into the box, and that came with a lot of problems. I gave an example of a class, I believe it was, where the students were asked to write. It was either Tom Sawyer or
Huckleberry Finn.
And there were at least 3 different approaches the students took to that. And I was amazed that it was the girls that actually took the stand to stay, and to do what they felt rather than what the teacher instructed. Can you just give a little bit about that situation and show how, because what it showed was the choices.
Yeah.
Children also
and what's important about that case, actually, is that this issue of Huckleberry Finn and its use in the schools is coming up again as a source of controversy. So the way what happened was there was a class at a high school in California where students, it was the honors English class, and students were reading Huckleberry Finn, and they wwere asked to write something on the book, and some of the students objected, some of the African American students objected to the use of the term, the N-word in the book, and they refused to do the assignment, and they chose to leave the class and take a lower level class rather than to stay. Another student that I spoke to who was in the class said that he's going to just give the teacher what the teacher wants. The teacher doesn't want to hear about slavery, doesn't want to hear a critique of slavery, so he'll just, in order to avoid being removed from the class or conflict with the teacher, he'll just do what the teacher's asked. But then the third student, this was the female student that you mentioned, she decided, no, she was not going to leave the class, and she was not going to give the teacher what the teacher wanted either. She was going to write an essay about the book and talk about the treatment of Jim, the slave that's talked about in the novel, and write about the novel as a story about slavery, because that's really, Huckleberry Finn is really a story about a white boy who is traveling with a runaway slave. And what their experience is like in the South. And there's no way you can write about that book without dealing with the issue of slavery. And what I found interesting about this is, we hear a lot this idea that our kids don't want to learn and equate learning in school with acting white. What we don't recognize is that in many schools, success for black students is premised on conformity, on speaking and acting a certain way, on thinking a certain way, and our children often resent that and resist that. What we have to do is find ways to help our kids to navigate school successfully so they don't have to choose between their identity and academic success. They need to be proud of who they are and academically successful. But that's a very difficult thing for a child to figure out on their own. And that's why it's so important that we have parents involved, and when there are no parents who can be involved, that we have other adults who are there that can provide, guidance and mentorship to young people.
You're exactly right. And the thing with black boys in the situation is that they get it from both sides. Girls get it also, but not to the extent. It is the pressure, the amount of pressure doesn't seem to be there, because with boys, they're labeled and criticized by their own. They're even actually ostracized. If they're smart boys, they're ostracized from the other black boys, and that's a painful thing. I actually witnessed that in one of my family members. The young man was smart, but he chose to come down, and his words to me was, "I have to live here."
Yeah. It's a really tough situation, because our boys have to cope with the harsh reality of the street. And out there on the street, what's valued is not how smart you are, but how tough you are, and your ability to maybe play sports, play basketball, to know the latest music, but not necessarily to understand science and math and literature. And that's a problem, because the stereotypes that are out there undermine our kids. Lead them to believe they have a better chance of making it as an athlete or a rap star than as an intellectual. And it also, we actually believe the stereotypes. And that's the real dangerous part, is that many of our kids buy into them, and it affects what they expect of themselves and what they pursue in life. I see so many young men, especially, who you'll see put hours into playing basketball. They're out there playing ball for hours in the dark, but they don't put any time into their homework. And if you try to explain to them that your chance of making it as a professional basketball player is so slim, so remote, you would do much better investing your time in learning and pursuing an education. Many of them just don't see it. And that's a lot about the role models they've been exposed to. It's also about the media and the way the images of what black men do are conveyed in the media, and reinforce this idea that it's athletics and entertainment that is our pathway to success. So we have to be careful, because many parents, I think, inadvertently contribute to that and send a message.
Right.
You see a lot of black parents, their kids are playing sports, they're at all the games. They go to see the football games, they go to see the basketball games, but they don't know the teacher, and they don't go to back-to-school night. And they're sending the message that sports is more important than learning. And that really undermines our children. It undermines their opportunity.
It really does. I've seen that a lot. A couple of nights ago, I had a phone call. It was kind of late, and the person was a friend of mine, and she asked, "Are you still awake?" I said, "Yes." So I just had to call. She had just heard that, I guess a friend of hers had a child, a kindergartner, that after 2 days was put in an alternative class situation for the entire year. After 2 days. Now, I can't imagine what a child that's probably 4 or 5 years old, I think is the age here. What could a 5-year-old do that would have them placed in alternative school at 5, for an entire year? And what happens to that child?
Yeah, no, this is a huge problem, because what's going on in schools is teachers decide based on the behavior of a child. You might have a little boy who's hyperactive. He has trouble sitting still. And because of that, they say this child needs to be put in a special education class. Well, the fact is that there are ways of dealing with children who are restless that don't necessarily involve giving them drugs or putting them in special education. For example, just teaching a child to play chess or teaching them to learn a musical instrument can give them the skills they need to concentrate and to focus. It is essential that kids learn how to focus in school and that they acquire some self-discipline. But we have so many kids now being medicated in school. It's an outrage, and it's very, very dangerous. We're also seeing large numbers of kids who are just being placed in special education classes simply because their teachers don't know how to teach them. So it's a huge problem. It's really a civil rights issue, because the educational rights of these children are being denied, and people are treating special education, if done properly, should be a resource, should be a source of support for children, because with each child who is is identified, the schools are required to do an individual assessment of that student, to diagnose what their learning needs are, and then to create a learning plan for that child. And so if it's done right, they should be finding ways to meet the child's needs. The problem is that in many schools, what they're doing instead is they use special ed as a place to put the children they don't want to teach or don't know how to teach. And so many times you go visit the classroom and you say, well, why are these kids here? I don't see anything wrong with them. And it's because there isn't anything wrong with them. The only thing wrong with them is that they haven't been taught properly.
Yeah, it's amazing the things that our children go through. And thinking of that child as as a 5-year-old, that even if placed back in the regular classroom for first grade, that child now has a stigma, and also the self-esteem is crushed. So that will require some work, to deal with. A message. Well, let me ask you one other question, and I told you that I was going to ask you this, and it has to do with our community efforts. We've been working with some concerns here in Tuscaloosa in our own system. And my question to you was, are we naive in thinking that as community advocates and parents that we can basically affect change on a system that heretofore has been resistant to change, to make any changes for the better?
Oh, we absolutely can. But it can only happen if parents are organized, if they spend time getting to understand how the system works and stay involved. It's very important that they not try to solve these problems as individuals exclusively, because it's very easy to just brush off one parent who has a complaint. But when you bring parents together and organize them, and they have some clear sense of what's wrong and what they want to address, that makes it much more likely that the schools will have to respond. I often say that when you go to schools in more affluent communities and you ask the educators, who are you accountable to? They will always say, we are accountable to the parents we serve. They don't talk about the superintendent. They don't talk about the school board. They talk about the parents. And that's because the parents they serve are organized, they're vigilant, they are watching what's going on, and they feel entitled to a good education for their children. When you go into low-income communities, particularly in urban areas, but also in some rural areas, where parents are not involved, the educators don't feel as though they have to be accountable to them at all. They're accountable to the superintendent of the district. And if you don't feel accountable to the parents, chances are you may not treat their children properly and with the respect that they deserve. So it's very important that parents be involved and that they vote in the school board elections and attend school board meetings and recognize that matters. That's going to have bearing on the kind of education their children receive.
Well, Dr. Noguera, we thank you so much for talking with us. You've given us so much insight, and we've learned a lot. I'm going to recommend this book, The Troubled Black Voice, especially, but also you had another one, the City School.
City School and the American Dream. That's another book.
Yes, I would recommend my listeners and anyone that I come in contact with read those, because in it we see examples of ourselves, of our system, and we also see solutions, and that's the other thing that I want to thank you for. You give in your writings, your research and all, you give something, action taken. I really, really appreciate you for that.
Thank you. I really think it's important that we not just complain, that we not just wring our hands and say what a shame, that we actually do something and get involved, because there's a lot that can be done. And we have a whole generation of young people at stake whose lives depend on what actions we as adults take right now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, 1 minute into the program, do you have a website or where we go and find more of your writings?
Yes, if they go to New York University website, they can look me up under faculty, and you'll see copies of my articles and books you can obtain right there online.
And thank you so much for joining us